In our previous lectures, we've been looking at this idea of global civil society, and we've also been looking at how civil society and the nation state interact with each other. In this lecture, we're going to concentrate more on looking specifically at government and NGO relationships. Globally, NGOs have increased ostensibly since World War II. Some explanations behind the rise of NGOs include the ability to satisfy needs for public goods, the ability to pursue collective interests, the ability to enhance positive externalities while lowering negative externalities, their level of trustworthiness, and perhaps maybe the wider political space, so to speak, afforded to them by the state. What's really interesting is that globally as well, governments have experienced a strain on their finances, which has consequently reduced its ability to deliver social services to its constituents. On the other hand, we have NGOs as an entity who have the capacity to be alternate sort of social and welfare providers, and they have generally proven to be quite effective at this task when they are provided with the space to operate. Therefore, if you're seeing the state retreating from social welfare provisions, we have NGOs who have the capacity to enter the space in which governments are retreating from, it would suggest that greater collaboration between both the government and NGOs would be fruitful. It would be advantageous for both parties. Nevertheless, we do witness low levels of collaboration, and it does beg the question, why indeed do we witness low levels of collaboration between government and NGOs? When we look at the literature which tries to explain low levels of collaboration between the state and the NGO, it can be divided into two camps. The first explanation, which explains low levels of collaboration between the state and NGOs, is attributed to the domination and strength of the state, which effectively seeks to control the NGO sector through restrictive regulations rather than partner with it. Whether overtly or not, the majority of the literature has contributed to this argument by suggesting a strong state that seeks to continuously manage and control the NGO sector. There's a second line of explanations which can be attributed to organizational differences between both sectors. The main premise here is that the organizational forms and goals of both sectors are divergent, and as such it dissuades the building of mutual trust or really acting as a potential credible catalyst to incentivize one or both parties to cooperate towards a common goal. Now, we don't really want to question the validity fully of either camps, but we can point out that neither one fully answers why the state authorities continue to resist the advance of NGOs despite the opportunities that are present in collaborative efforts. As mentioned in the previous slide, it sort of makes sense that they actually collaborate. Again, the state's retreating from social welfare provisions. We have NGOs who can actually entertain and engage in these kinds of social provisions that the state is withdrawing from. So it sort of makes sense that they do collaborate. So in this particular lecture, we're going to delve a bit deeper and look into a study looking at the context of China, which suggests why do we see these low levels of collaboration, and offer several explanations that go beyond these two mainstream camps. The study that I will focus on in this particular lecture draws upon the cases of Beijing and Shanghai in China. The speculation is that Beijing, as the capital city, may present unique challenges to local officials in their collaboration or lack thereof with NGOs. The municipal government of Shanghai, on the other hand, has cultivated networks with selected NGOs. In addition, Shanghai's municipal government has become a stronger voice in Shanghai's developmental policy in comparison to Beijing, where the top-down model of governance continues to prevail. This means that in the Beijing context, there might be less room for local innovation or experimentation. Whereas in Shanghai, there's a greater sense of innovation that occurs at the community level, whereby local NGOs are given greater leeway to experiment. And in fact, they encourage citizen participation in community projects. The sample I will present has 28 NGOs who were interviewed, 15 in Beijing and 13 in Shanghai. And it represents a cross-section with respect to NGOs' material power, their symbolic power, interpretive power, and geographical power. These forms of powers was one of our topics of discussion in the first lecture. The NGOs interviewed within the sample have a budget between $1,590 and $6.35 million per annum, with the average NGO interviewed having a budget of $78,000 per annum. Most NGOs interviewed had secured their financial resources with the aid of a mix of domestic and international funding support. The mean number of years for NGOs in our sample was 8.5 years, and it ranged between 2 to 19 years. Nearly half of the NGOs who were in the sample were registered with an accompanying government sponsoring agency, and the other half registered as businesses. Notwithstanding their registration as businesses, however, they are primarily functional as an NGO. Now, these NGOs do not offer a national sample, but they do provide a depiction of the increasing involvement of the local state in the work of NGOs in two of China's most important cities. Before jumping into the empirical findings of the study, it's worthwhile looking at some theoretical frameworks that we'll be engaging with. Notably, we'll be looking at new institutional theory. And new institutional theory looking at particularly isomorphic pressures. The idea here is that there's a strength of isomorphic pressures for NGOs, and it's contingent upon the environment in which they operate. According to neo-institutional theories, organizations that occupy a shared sector will eventually begin to copy one another due to coercive, mimemic, and normative pressures. A key element of institutional theory is the belief that organizations sharing the same environment will employ similar practices and thus become isomorphic with each other. So in this sort of classic formulation, when we look at isomorphic pressures, we can see that coercive isomorphism stems from political influence. Mimemic isomorphism results from standard responses to uncertainty. And normative isomorphism is associated with professionalization. Put differently, coercive pressures can be displayed by examining the impact of state regulation on the behavior of an NGO. For example, regulations in China forbid NGOs from conducting public fundraising. This ultimately forced NGOs to mostly rely on private and institutional donations, which often accompany certain stipulations that alter NGOs' behavior. Mimemic isomorphism has a tendency to occur in an uncertain environment, where organizations will begin to copy successful models as a mechanism for coping with changeable conditions. By copying, NGOs are able to quickly establish legitimacy without having to build a repertoire of practices, which can be time-consuming without necessarily leading to any tangible outcomes. This is notably pronounced in the case of China, where the environment for NGOs can oscillate depending on state behavior. So NGOs might acquiesce to state agencies, and due to the fact this is a strategy that can lead to an economic gain as well as legitimacy. Finally, normative isomorphism emerges when similar attitudes and approaches lead to homogeneity. Often the result of hiring practices, mind you, that stress like educational achievement or inter-hiring between existing organizations. Normative pressures are often brought about by the desire to professionalize, which can lead to greater homogeneity of the NGO sector. Now, the reason why we're looking at new institutional theory, there's a strength in utilizing this sort of theory to understand NGO behavior. It lies in the fact that it's able to explain why organizations adopt certain practices, whether it's mundane or complex practices, in environments where they have little influence to reject said practices. Chinese NGOs operate in a relatively singular institutional environment, whereby competing logics do not cause contestation, and thus much variation in institutional designs. Organizational change with regards to NGOs in China is particularly dependent on the political environment and the power of institutional actors in their support or opposition to change. The political aspect is one that is readily acknowledged by neo-institutionalists. Notwithstanding the increasing quantity and diversity of the NGO sector in Beijing and Shanghai, coercive isomorphic pressures are prevalent due to the existing regulatory environment that manages NGOs. At the time of the study, officially all NGOs were required to be registered with the Ministry of Civil Affairs, in addition to having a willing department or leading unit to sponsor the organization. Given that there are minimal incentives for government departments or units to take on the extra administrative work that is really required to sponsor an NGO, and there's a strong disincentive of being liable in the event an NGO becomes troublesome, it's not surprising that government sponsorship is difficult to secure. This is even to the extent that the majority of NGOs are prevented from completing registration. Now, what we do find in a situation where an NGO has compiled a dual registration sort of process, all NGOs' decisions are technically required to be approved by the sponsoring agency, and NGOs must provide annual financial reports to the Ministry of Civil Affairs. This effectively means that the autonomy of the organization is eroded, and in the long run, it will incentivize the NGO sector to forge practices in a homogeneous sort of fashion to ensure a higher degree of predictability for the state. Now, as sort of hinted, many organizations will avoid this lengthy bureaucratic process by registering as a for-profit commercial or business entity. Despite that situation, such organizations are essentially operating and presenting themselves as NGOs. This suggests that coercive isomorphic pressures prevail irrespective of whether organizations are officially registered as an NGO, commercial business entity, or foundation. That is to say, the state's management system will direct some NGOs to channel their efforts into areas the state finds most acceptable in any case. The regulatory environment for NGOs in China contribute to maintaining social stability by keeping out those organizations that the government perceives as a threat. And it minimizes the size and strength of the NGO sector, which in turn may limit NGOs' collaborative efforts with the local state. Suffice it to say, efforts to launch collaborative projects between the local state and NGOs in Beijing and Shanghai are limited. Although collaboration offers both parties, the state and NGO, an opportunity to pool resources, the local state rarely engages in voluntary collaborative efforts, save for the fact when the local state is familiar and knowledgeable of a specific individual NGO project. Another sort of strategic methodology to sustain contact and collaboration with the local state is to mobilize NGOs' material power and market their services to the city. Now, whether or not these strategies translate to projecting an increased level of mimemic isomorphic pressures is another narrative. The evidence suggests that while the NGOs who have copied a successful model to market their services, they have done so without the awareness of each other's tactics. Granted, the model organization may be unaware of their potential mimemic activity in this respect, or the models of success may be diffused unintentionally through employee transfer or turnover or via an association. However, this is not really a possibility that can be entertained in the context of Beijing and Shanghai. To reiterate, the NGOs who did successfully market their material resources to the state had no direct awareness of each other's work and have self-reported little to no awareness of other NGOs' activities. They are working in completely different sectors of operation furthermore, and as such have little chance of unintentional contact that may lead to copying tactics, and they rarely experience employee transfers from other NGOs. Uncertainties in the institutional environment and their relationships with local government have led them to develop an independently derived, pragmatic approach to market their material power to local authorities. Interestingly, this tactic becomes difficult to execute, given that local government often have not really achieved the sufficient epistemic awareness of NGOs' potential capacity. Even when epistemic awareness has been achieved by local government, some NGOs have experienced competition with authorities in delivering social welfare services. The representative of a Shanghai-based NGO explains that it's not unusual for the government to steal the ideas and programs of small successful NGOs. For example, the representative points out to an NGO we're going to call ST that sells goods over the internet for charities. It has faced stiff competition from the Shanghai government, particularly through the means of a government-organized NGO-backed sort of entity. Now, this Gongo, for short, has benefited from government backing and contacts, and as a result has managed to secure the financial support from large corporations such as KPMG. ST's representatives believe that the poaching of such ideas may be detrimental to smaller NGOs that are unable to compete with bigger NGOs and Gongos with greater material and geographical powers. In fact, the interview with ST's representative confirms a level of wariness towards government officials. And I quote, "When they, the government, do not come up with creative solutions or think of solutions on their own, but instead borrow the ideas of other NGOs to implement their programs, this not only fails to increase the growth of creativity in our society, more importantly, it reduces the willingness of social organizations to come up with new and creative solutions and constrains the integration of resources in society and grassroots organizations. This is what makes it frightening." The representative for ST indicates that interactions with government officials can be hazardous, not only for individual NGOs, but for the sector as a whole, due to the fear that idea poaching reduces incentives to be innovative and ultimately reduces NGOs' potential interpretive power. Competition from the local government is one obstacle that NGOs have to contend with, but threat of absorption is another hazard. In the early years, another NGO, we're going to call it BC, has had to stave off government attempts to co-opt and absorb the NGO into existing governmental structures that work in the area of cultural heritage. BC has been approached by local officials to become, and I quote, part of their government branch, like a Gongo, which they refused. BC has managed to maintain its independence, and perhaps it is due to previous experiences of being subject to co-optation that the representative now emphasizes that the NGO does not collaborate with local authorities. Instead, at best, they will work beside them. Now, some NGOs in our sample have not been so fortunate to ward off incorporation by the government. The representative of LS, for example, recounts the experiences of the free lunch program. Via the internet platform, the free lunch program was able to solicit substantial donations from the public to provide free lunch to needy school children across the nation. The success has since attracted the attention of the government, and according to the representative of LS, the initiative has been eaten up by one of the branches of the government and turned into a government program. Small and potentially successful NGOs are vulnerable to such government incorporation. NGOs that have reported difficulties in establishing collaborative opportunities have portrayed local authorities as lacking trust and knowledge of the sector. In fact, less than half of our NGO interviewees believe that knowledge levels of the local authorities in Beijing and Shanghai have improved with regards to the NGO sector, whereas more than half of the interviewees suggested that the knowledge levels and trust for NGOs are still extremely low. So how can we explain a seemingly contradictory perspective? Based on the collaborative interaction between NGOs and the local state, we can conclude that knowledge of individual NGOs have improved, but that this knowledge is difficult to extrapolate to the wider sector. Given that it's difficult and politically unwise for NGOs to form alliances, thereby reducing opportunities to amass greater geographical power, smaller and newer NGOs will have greater challenges in gaining the attention and support of local officials. It is really the well-established NGOs with relatively longer organizational histories will likely have a near monopoly on potential collaborative partnerships with the local state. Where there's a collaboration between the smaller and newer NGOs, it tends to be at an ad hoc level and rarely lasts beyond a single project. Such circumstances usually occur in individual cases that the local authorities have identified as needy. Thus, the knowledge level of the NGO sector is also dependent on the local authorities' awareness of certain social issues and the degree of importance that is assigned to these issues. The interviews also suggest that greater state collaboration and epistemic awareness of NGOs by the local state will be achieved through the professionalization of NGOs. This is really a heuristic sort of variable that signals normative isomorphic change. Professionalization in the context of this study essentially refers to having established a respected organizational identity alongside a continuation and an expansion of its service provisions to relevant constituents. Seemingly normative pressures to homogenize comes from the similar attitudes and approaches through the process of professionalization. In fact, one of the representatives we interviewed noted that local authorities are more willing to grant collaboration once NGOs have developed professional capacity and gained the approval of the wider community. A number of NGOs in our sample further clarify the meaning of professional capacity as the capacity to provide services. In fact, one representative from Shanghai echoes this sentiment, expressing that opportunities to work with the local authorities will occur when the NGO is seen to contribute a service to the population. Now, we have to point out this may prove problematic for nearly half of our NGOs sampled, as they lack geographical power and financial resources or material power to sustain momentum on the projects that they currently engage with. With 13 of the 28 NGOs interviewed operating on a budget of less than $20,000 US per annum, establishing trust and professionalization through service provision will be severely hampered. What is interesting to observe is the number of NGO representatives that equate service provision and the added value of the NGO as a determinant factor to potential collaboration with the local state. In fact, this evaluation is echoed by another Beijing NGO that we're going to call FC. FC says, what is very important is that an NGO has to be very professional and valuable so the government can see its effect. In fact, the representative further adds weight to the notion of NGOs needing to create value in order to be considered by the local authorities. And I quote, NGOs need to have the capacity to solve problems, the capacity to provide services. Otherwise, the government would not trust your NGO to do work. In this vein, to further enhance trust and build knowledge, NGOs have implemented programs that are needed by local authorities. What we do see is that direct contact and communication with individual officials is another tactic by which some NGOs have used to foster epistemic awareness of the NGO's capacity and collaboration potential. These various strategies for improving the knowledge of local authorities of the NGO sector and building trust have indeed improved the potential for collaborative relationships between the state and the NGO. The majority of this lecture has focused on the Chinese case, notably in the case of Beijing and Shanghai. What we gather from this study is that the local state lacks meaningful knowledge of the NGO sector, just as NGOs have not sufficiently matured to become part of an epistemic community. Given that NGOs are relatively new to the social landscape in China, the Chinese NGO sector has not developed sufficiently to become part of a mature epistemic community in which their expertise or interpretive powers can be used as reference points by the state. In time, however, it is quite plausible that NGOs in China may become part of a mature community of experts, where they can more effectively harness not only their material power, but also their symbolic, interpretive, and geographical powers. There are, however, reservations in this regard. we can prognosticate that it's not simply a matter of time before Chinese NGOs mature into a maturing epistemic community. Rather, given the strength of the Chinese state and the existence of strong coercive isomorphic pressures, any production of knowledge outside the state arena may challenge the legitimacy of China's party state and thereby become intolerable and ultimately hinder the development of NGOs. In effect, the existence of such structural inertia that is rooted in the party state system and regulatory framework that undeniably dominates local state NGO relationships mean that NGOs will need to stay one step ahead of the state. For example, NGOs will have to anticipate the next major social problem and enact upon it with programmatic endeavors. When executing such a strategy, we can posit that NGOs will more likely gain the trust of state authorities through a best practices framework or following successful NGO models that will, in the end, lead to greater possibilities of collaboration with the local state. Moreover, a best practices framework will entice the NGO sector to professionalize under the auspices of mimemic and normative isomorphic pressures. Of course, the scenario in which the state may attempt to compete and or absorb innovative NGOs can be a reality. While the institutional environment in which NGOs are operating is slowly changing, thereby allowing greater participation of NGOs to address a number of social issues, the majority of the NGOs we've interviewed still perceive the state as having limited meaningful knowledge of the sector. Furthermore, even if epistemic awareness is achieved, it is quite plausible that the state will develop a strategy of strategic ignorance to various degree of acknowledgement of an NGO. So this variance and this strategic ignorance will be dependent on a pragmatic calculus that is based on the NGO's resources for social and welfare considerations. In essence, by factoring whether NGOs can utilize its material power rather than their symbolic, interpretive, or geographical powers to supplement the local state's social and welfare provisions. The underlying reasoning for this presumptuous theory is based on the idea of factual ignorance, which suggests that local government officials can utilize competing facts about NGOs as capital. Part of this calculation involves mediating the uncertainty of forging working partnerships with NGOs presently. The second reasoning is the idea that strategic ignorance can be used as a defensive strategy, whereby errors or problems can allude to an interpretation of evidence and further exonerate local authorities from engaging with NGOs. This concludes our lecture on government-NGO relationships. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at accountability and legitimacy.